Hello there. My name is Ingemar and welcome to this video. I'm talking with Nick Richards, who heads up our data protection, GDPR compliance team. We are HCL, a management consultancy helping law firms and other businesses with running their businesses, a lot of compliance support. And in this particular occasion, we're talking about the data protection support. So Nick heads up the team, and there's his profile in here. And we do offer GDPR data protection support. So today we're going to be answering a question about data processing agreements with a discussion around controllers and processors. So Nick, can you explain what a data controller and a data processor is?
Yeah. Under the GDPR, a data controller determines the purpose and the means of the processing of the data. So effectively, the purpose means why are we doing this? And the means how are we doing this? And to be a controller, you have to be determining both of those elements. So why are we doing this and how are we doing this? So generally speaking, when any organization collects personal data from individuals, they become a controller of that data, and therefore they take on responsibility for what happens to that data. And it's worth remembering that in a company, for example, under the GDPR, because directors can now be held personally liable, it's very important that people do take the control of that data very seriously. A processor effectively works for a controller and can only process the data on the detailed written instructions of the controller. So a good example would be if you're a law firm and you have your data hosted by Microsoft, for example. Microsoft are a processor because you are the controller of that data and they are simply storing that data and looking after it for you. And if you look at any agreement with the likes of Microsoft, they will describe themselves as a processor. And there are also joint controllers and there are also separate controllers. So going back to the definition, if a controller determines the purposes and the means of the processing, for example, if a law firm was to have an external contracted lawyer and they worked on a case together, then they would be joint controllers because they are effectively both determining the purpose and the means of the processing and on the same data. You could also have separate controllers where two controllers are processing the same data, but for a different purpose. So the first thing that any organization needs to determine is whether you are a controller, or whether you're a processor, a joint controller, or a separate controller. So obviously we can give advice if there's any confusion as to where you sit. And it's also possible to be a controller and a processor at the same time, just to make it even more confusing.
Absolutely. And you referred to law firms, but this applies to any business and
Absolutely.
international business. And I guess, therefore, it's really important to know where your data is hosted.
Absolutely. Very important because as a controller, you are responsible for that data and what happens to it. And we will talk about data processing agreements separately, but that's why it's very important to know where your data is hosted. Ideally, if you're a UK organization, host it in the UK or in the EU, because that means there's no restricted transfers of that data, which is a whole other video.
Well, absolutely, because it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction as to what rules apply. And so we talked about data controllers and data processors. Can you just explain why this is important? Who's going to enforce it? What is the legislation? What's the effect of the enforcement?
Ultimately, it comes down to your responsibility under the GDPR. So as I said, if you are a controller, if you determine that you're a controller, then you have legal responsibility for being transparent about the data, what you're going to do with it, informing the individuals through your privacy notice, for example, what you're going to do with that data, whether you're going to share it with anybody, how you're going to store it and protect it, what technical and organizational controls you're putting in place. All these things are mandatory under the GDPR. And as we all know, there are significant fines for organizations that don't stick to the rules under the GDPR.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was really interesting. If you have any questions or would like to ask us to review something, do some training, or help you in any way, then please do get in touch. The email address is ingemar@hunningsconsultancy.co.uk, or you would have seen at the beginning the website. So please go to there and fill in the enquiry form. So I hope you found that it helped. The final thing is, please would you subscribe to the channel so that you may see other videos that you might find useful coming up there. Thank you very much.